Tony, EU officials say they want Ukraine in the bloc, adding, "They're one of us." That's a quote. But before you guys join, here's another $500 million in military support. Here are some warplanes. Just fight the Russians, and then you're one of us. You can be a member of the bloc.
Well, I mean, let's not forget that it was the European Union that were very much involved in installing a pro-Western government in Kiev in the coup of 2014, which all of the Western press seems to have forgotten about. I mean, we really are moving into a demented, deranged press world where only one side's information is going to be looked at or talked about. The basic fact is that back in December, the Russians said the security situation in Eastern Europe needs to be sorted out. You have pulled out of various treaties, and so we've got to fix this. The West, NATO, the Pentagon, the British, and the European Union all turn their backs on Putin. Of course, it's a serious consideration for the Russians to make sure that they're not having all the weapons that then poured in. Weapons then started pouring into Ukraine. Of course, the Russians felt like they had to do something about that, and they've realised that the diplomatic channels have been slammed in their faces. And so, as a result of that, they have decided that the only option for them is to take military action on the ground. None of this has been reported really in the West at all. Nothing. And just, I mean, it's becoming a propaganda war where one side speaks to itself and the other side speaks to itself.
Right.
And there's very little in between.
Right.
I don't want to say that the Russian media or any media, actually it's probably the Middle Eastern media like Al Jazeera and yourselves that have been more balanced on this subject. For example, one of the main stories that's not at all been covered here in the West whatsoever is the Ukrainian army, which has been lodging itself and embedding itself in civilian areas amongst tower blocks and this sort of thing, in order to make sure that if the Russians want to shoot at them, then they're going to have to shoot into civilian areas. Now, this is not being reported here at all, but it's a very important fact that people need to know to understand what's going on. And we're not going to get, I don't think, in the future, any kind of balanced reporting, particularly from here in the West. My experience working many years ago at the BBC tells me that they have now decided that the big corporations, the big media corporations, many of whose money, by the way, is squirreled away in tax havens, that they are going to just simply back the
Tony,
West
bear with me.
in its attacks on, in its attacks on Russia as into the indefinite future now.
I'll get back to you, Tony. Richard, what do you make of the Russian ambassador to the UN just a few hours ago accusing the US? Our light's gone. Accusing the US of a disinformation campaign, that this conflict started on Thursday morning and that there was no fighting in the breakaway Donbass region over the past 8 years, or something called the Minsk Agreement that granted autonomy for the Donbass but was never granted.
Well, there has been one broken agreement after another, and this disinformation just continues nonstop. But there was an agreement in 2014 to end the demonstrations and withdraw the police, and then the Nazis attacked. I mean, they were real Nazis, and they overthrew the government there. So that agreement was abrogated. Minsk 1 and 2 were abrogated by the Ukrainian government side. There was shelling. There were casualties, many casualties in the eastern part of the Ukraine. It's very important to take note of, along with the JCPOA with Iran, these other broken treaties. In 2019 was the abrogation by the United States of the INF Treaty, which paved the way for the reintroduction of intermediate and short-range missiles, which could be nuclear-tipped, into the NATO states, and with the idea that they would be introduced into Ukraine, and Ukraine would become the kind of final seal on the border, or almost the final seal on the border with Russia. And if it was part of NATO now, and the INF Treaty is abrogated, then the door is open to those missiles being 5 or 10 minutes away from major population centers in Russia.
Sure. Richard, let me just switch back to Tony. We've got the lighting back. Someone's paid the electric. Tony, Russia argues there's a loud yet powerful minority governing Ukraine that are dictating to the vast majority of others how they view their history. If you could give us just a short answer on that, then we'll get back to you.
Okay, so I think the thing that people need to understand is just what it means to be a member of NATO. That nowadays, I'm afraid, what that really means is that your intelligence services are controlled through NATO. So even for countries like Croatia, as they're joining NATO, they have to understand they're handing over their intelligence services to another organisation, actually based in Brussels. And as the intelligence is taken over by NATO, then what happens is then that intelligence services is used to spy on all the democratic institutions, such as the judges of the country, the lawmakers, the MPs of the country are spied on by the NATO intelligence services. Also, the journalists are spied on by the NATO intelligence services, and this is the method by which the NATO is actually far more political power than people give it credit for. You'll also find, by the way, that there is one good thing about all this crazy propaganda, that even though it convinces many people in the target countries that, in this case Putin is demonised successfully, if you remember back in the Second World War, the great British writer George Orwell, he resigned from the BBC because he said there's no point in this propaganda. It only brings you short-term gains. And at the end of the day, these things will have to be fought out on the battlefield somewhere.
Okay.
And that is where these big decisions are going to be made, ultimately. So by going down this propaganda route, NATO and the NATO countries have basically set themselves on the road for World War III. And so we need to be talking. We need to be opening up those diplomatic channels, or else that's almost a one-way street.
Tony, stay with me. Richard, stay with me. Let's take a look at what some social media reactions have said regarding the latest developments. Atlanta says stand with Russia because they are doing what the USA or any other country would do to prevent infringements on Russia. Putin has been too patient with NATO. And the USA, UK broken promises. The 2014 coup in Ukraine installing a USA client state escalated, caused the Russian-Ukraine conflict. Ibrimo says NATO has led to the 14,500 dead in Libya, 165,000 dead in Afghanistan, 224,000 dead in Syria, 1,200,000 dead in Iraq. It didn't shock anyone. None of these countries have been sanctioned. Portable Sugar says, why can't you all tell NATO to keep away from Ukraine? Stop adding fuel to the fire. The Canadian president should make efforts to bargain peace with Russia through diplomacy. Both nations should stick to the Minsk agreement and stop spewing venom against each other. XRP says the Ukraine has US bioweapons labs on the border of Russia. They're getting US weapons and trying to obtain NATO membership, which will allow NATO to envelop Russia even further. You sound totally clueless about the situation, to be honest. Go study the Cold War. Richard, picking up on one of the posts that gave all the stats about the NATO that led to the deaths, Russia argues again that the West is waging a disinformation campaign on the Ukraine conflict, saying its forces never attack civilians or civilian infrastructure. But we do know American forces absolutely carpet bombed cities, entire cities in Iraq and Syria, wiping out civilian neighborhoods in their entirety. And there is drone footage from Western news agencies to prove that. But the footage in Ukraine, not all of it has been independently certified. What do you make of that? I mean, you can almost smell the hypocrisy here.
Well, certainly you can. And as an anti-war activist who's been involved in fighting back against the U.S. and NATO wars, we certainly know about the hypocrisy. And, you know, down till today, the people who all swore that they knew that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, and that included, you know, President Bush and Condoleezza Rice and Colin Powell and not just the Republicans, but Nancy Pelosi and the other Democratic leaders, they all swore back in 2002, 2003, they knew for sure that Iraq had these weapons, and therefore it was justified to launch shock and awe. The shock and awe attack that ended up. And if you go back to the first Gulf War and put them all together, we don't really know how many millions of people have died as a result of wars based on false pretenses. You know, these wars and those who carried them out should really be the subject of criminal investigation, war crime and investigation. And instead we get something like the present situation in Ukraine and Russia, and you would think, well, nothing like this has ever happened before. This is the greatest evil, that Putin is the worst since Hitler. And I mean, all of this, I mean, talk about disinformation, and they're completely writing off of any of the reasons why, from the Russian point of view, I believed that the way that they were seeing it was that maybe not officially, but de facto, Ukraine was being brought into NATO, and billions of dollars of weapons were going in, and okay, maybe the U.S. couldn't get the vote right now because it has to be unanimous in NATO, but they were making a de facto NATO ally.
Okay, let me just segue from that and tap into Tony's history expertise. Tony, is this tragic for Moscow to see over the decades what happened after the breakdown of the Soviet Union, in particular the sacrifice made by the great majority of Ukrainians as part of the Red Army that defeated the Nazis, who were ethnic Russians and helped end the Second World War, turning against Moscow?
Well, look, I mean, I don't think by any means all of the Ukrainians will be turning against Moscow, despite what the Western press is telling us, and their internal press, which, by the way, is heavily censored, has been, certainly since 2014, since the time of the coup. The Western-oriented presidents have been censoring the press enormously in Ukraine. So, I mean, the country itself is divided. The actual majority of the Ukrainian people would much rather the East and West just keep their fingers out of their country and let them get on with it. But I'm afraid what's happened is that through the National Endowment for Democracy and other pro-NATO organisations, the Pentagon, etc., mostly US interests, not European interests 5,000 miles away, have been pushing and pushing on Ukraine to take sides here and not to be an independent country. So most Ukrainians would much rather Washington, London and Moscow get their fingers out of Ukraine. The trouble is, Ukraine is the next stick with which to beat Russia by Western governments. And that's meant that, I'm afraid, it's a pawn, effectively, of Western foreign policy, and therefore it's bound to be interfered with. But we're in a very once the diplomatic relations break down, as they began to do last year, and they now fully have now, between Russia and NATO and Russia and the West, we really need to be very concerned that a major war doesn't break out, because it certainly can now. We need to have those diplomatic lines open.
Indeed,
if you think about what was going on before the First World War and what was going on before the Second World War, we're really back there. But now there's nuclear weapons and television to add to the most horrific things that happened in the past.
I've got 30 seconds. Richard, as all advocates against the war are saying, the best solution to this crisis is a peaceful settlement. In 30 seconds, if you can, how can that be achieved at this stage?
Well, of course it can be achieved, but it's going to be very difficult. and I would really very much second what your other guest is saying, is there is a real danger that this can escalate, and that it can escalate all the way to a nuclear war. That's a possibility, and as he was saying, World War I, a few weeks before it started, I don't think anyone was thinking, hey, let's have a big war. But then came the big war, and it can come about by deliberate or unintentional actions being taken that lead to climbing the escalation ladder.
Gentlemen,
I would just say finally, I think China's role here is crucial, and we haven't heard anywhere near enough about that.
Right.
Indeed. China, gentlemen, thank you very much indeed for your time. Richard Becker is an anti-war activist from the Answer Coalition, joining us from San Francisco. Tony Gosling is a historian and investigative journalist, joining us from the British city of Bristol. That brings an end to our special coverage regarding the crisis in Eastern Europe.